opposition to speak to the bill, Vermilion, Lloydminster.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here to this amendment to send this particular bill to committee. I think the predominant aspect of this particular discussion, and indeed the entire discussion surrounding Bill 6, has been one of confusion, one of misinformation, and one whereby farmers that are directly affected by the legislation that is being proposed feel that the information that has come from this government, at the very admission of this government, has been inconsistent and inaccurate. It is particularly difficult to obtain the trust of any group of people, whether that be farmers or any group that you're dealing with, when you're not consistent in what you're telling them. And I want to use, just a few examples of the inconsistencies in the messaging and what has gone out on critical issues with regard to this piece of legislation. The question of paid versus unpaid workers, and whether paid or unpaid workers would be subject to workers' compensation and OH&S regulations. The initial information that came from this government was crystal clear that both paid and unpaid workers that this legislation would be applicable to both, not just to paid, as now the amendments are saying, and now that is being said was always the intention. Another area of confusion was the applicability of the legislation to the work of children on farms. The initial information then went out, and I want to stress that this is information that went out well before the first meeting in Grand Prairie on the 26th of November. This was information that was on the website at the time that the legislation was first introduced. That the information with regards to the work of children on the farm that caused so much concern amongst farmers, amongst ranchers, many of whom had come through the 4-H system, a system that has been operating in this province for over a century, that indeed it was felt that 4-H would become something that was threatened by this legislation. Now we're told that no, that was never the intent. But very clearly in the information that came out initially with this bill, the work of children and the work of children through 4-H clubs would definitely be affected. And now the most recent thing that has caused, once again, not just confusion, but in fact has now caused division and has caused resentment, and that is the exemption for the members of Hutterite colonies. Now, in my practice, I worked with Hutterite colonies. I have 5 colonies in my constituency. And I find, actually my interaction with them is quite interesting because they speak German. And I speak German as well, and it's an interesting interaction that we have. But the Hutterite colonies have been very clear on this message, and that is they do not want a special exemption that separates them from their farming neighbors. They feel a kinship with those who share the land around them, and they do not want to be treated in a way that is special or different from the others that till the land. So these sorts of things are causing the kinds of anger, the kinds of confusion, and the kinds of mistrust that is now the hallmark of this legislation, a legislation that clearly requires the trust of the people, not the kind of distrust that we've seen. And sadly, we've also seen some myths crop up. One of the myths that I think is the most damaging, and one of the myths that I find the most, I'll use the word disgusting, and that is this myth that farmers don't care about safety. And to suggest that if you're opposed to this bill, that somehow you're opposed to farm safety. That is the easy way out. That is the easy way out when you're showing opposition to this piece of legislation, that you say, oh, well, those that are opposing it, they just don't care about safety. I can assure you, Madam Speaker, and I think that this is something we should put to rest right now, that whether you're for Bill 6 or against Bill 6, you care about the safety of farmers, you care about the safety of farm workers, and you care about making sure that everybody gets home safely at night. And to suggest otherwise, Madam Speaker, is disingenuous and, in my view, lowers the debate on this subject. Just as the same as this myth that workers' compensation is the be-all and end-all, and that workers' compensation will somehow ensure that all workers will be adequately protected in the event of an injury. We know that the Premier is on the public record as being extremely critical of workers' compensation in this province. We know that she has said that workers suffer and that workers' health and their dignity and their future is threatened by a workers' compensation board system that does not properly serve injured workers in this province. And yet, they've had 7 months to correct all of the deficiencies in the workers' compensation board, but that hasn't happened. But despite the fact that this flawed system, or at least the system the Premier says is flawed, is still in place, that still has not been changed, that still has not been amended in 24 days, 23 now, this system will be foisted upon the farmers and the farm workers of this province. I would suggest that the thing to do first is to fix the problem with WCB before you foist it on those that will supposedly receive protections from it. But there are myths on all sides. And, you know, the kind of hyperbole and the kinds of myths that then spring up is, for example, one that came around on social media, and I was discussing this just a couple of hours ago with the Minister of Agriculture, and I find this myth to be incredible, that somehow Bill 6 allows for wind turbines and solar panels to be established on farmland without the permission of the landowner. That somehow is something that Bill 6 allows? I mean, that's preposterous. And unfortunately, when the temperature, it's crazy. So that's the kind of thing, unfortunately, Madam Speaker, that when the temperature is elevated in this kind of debate, you all of a sudden get these sorts of myths propagated. And they're propagated on both sides. And, you know, the problem we have now is what we have is now we have these amendments. 6 pages worth of hastily thrown together amendments to amend a 5-page long bill. You know, you have to just read something into it, then when you need 6 pages worth of amendments to amend a 5-page long bill, that there's something wrong with the original piece of legislation.
You think?
Madam Speaker, this piece of legislation has been poorly conceived, poorly communicated, and dismally executed by this government. And they are finding out, to their dismay, that in fact governing is not an easy thing to do. And they are relatively new at this process. And so mistakes can be made, and we can acknowledge that, you know, to a certain extent, some degree of shall we say, forbearance should be allowed because the mistakes can be made. But, Madam Speaker, the way to then realize that it is in a bit of a wreck right now is not to forge ahead, is not to go ahead and just step on the gas. It is, in fact, to pause. It is, in fact, to take time to step back and say, look, there are some problems here. We need to basically take a step back and take the opportunity to do some real consultation, to bring in some of the experts. You know, there has been a lot of work done on farm safety in the past, and I would be curious to know from members of the government, were members of the Farm Safety Advisory Council, were they consulted, were they brought into the discussions, and indeed, were any of the discussions and any of the recommendations that they brought forward in their 2012 report, were they incorporated into this legislation? Not based on what I've seen in the legislation, no. And yet that particular consultation was province-wide, had representation from a wide range of community and commodity groups, and provided with some of the most cogent and most well-thought-out recommendations on this issue. Furthermore, our farmers that have come to us at these various meetings, that have communicated to us through email and other means, have given us suggestions as to how farm safety could be incented, how it could be encouraged through a number of means. For example, under the Growing Forward 2 program, there is a financial incentive to farmers who improve their animal handling facilities. For example, and I've experienced this myself in veterinary practice. When you're doing animal handling, some people have very good facilities and some people have very poor facilities. And quite frankly, the risk of injury to either the animal or the operator goes up considerably when facility design and facilities are poorly put together. And this is something that, wherever possible, we need to avoid. And there are a number of means whereby safe practices can in fact be acknowledged, can be recognized, and can be rewarded. But instead of using an encouraging and educational system that moves the farm safety issue forward, instead, we have punitive measures. We have measures that are intended to, to cause things like shutdown of farming operations, sometimes at critical times of the year. That does not move this debate forward. Today we had the Minister of Jobs, Skills, Training and Labour saying that we want to create a culture of farm safety in this province. It's astounding to me. Create a culture of farm safety? Again, I think this is a tremendous insult to our farmers. What do you think they have as a culture of farm safety thus far? That's suggesting that there's been no concern about farm safety prior to today. I think that, to me, if knowing many farmers who are tremendously concerned about farm safety, I think that is a tremendously insulting thing. And finally, Madam Speaker, there's the whole process of legislating first and then putting regulations together afterwards. A process that the Minister of Agriculture described as odd. A process that the honourable member for Edmonton Beverly Clareview, when he sat on this side of the House, when he was debating the Condo Act last year, said was the wrong path to go. That in fact legislating before the regulations were worked out was a disservice to condo owners, was a disservice to those who made their residences in condominiums. Well, Madam Speaker, the situation for farmers is no different than what it was for condo owners. This is a bad way to proceed. It does not engender the trust in those individuals that will be directly affected by the legislation that is being discussed. Madam Speaker, the entire execution of this piece of legislation has been poor from the outset. It has been poorly communicated and it has been, as I said, very poorly executed. The government should recognize this. I believe they have, given the number of apologies that have already been made by members of this government. And if they wish to save face, and if they wish to save credibility, not just with rural Albertans, but with all Albertans, they would recognize that they have done a ham-handed job on this piece of legislation, and they would step back and say, we are going to take a step back and give Albertans the opportunity through a legislative policy committee to properly consult on this piece of legislation. That's the mature and prudent way of doing things. Now, there will be some that will say, oh, you're flip-flopping, oh, you're blinking. Quite frankly, I think the sign of real leadership is to recognize when things have not been executed well, to recognize when things have not been done in a proper manner, and to recognize and to admit it, or as we say sometimes, if you mess up, fess up. This is what this government needs to do. This government needs to recognize the poor job that it has done in communicating Bill 6 and in executing Bill 6, and recognize that in doing so, it has insulted the very people on the land that feed us, the very people that provide us with not just with the food that we eat, but the stewardship of our lands across this province, the very people that built this province, and the very people whose pride has been shown over these last few weeks, not just on the front steps of the legislature, not just in town hall meetings across our province, but in hundreds of cards and letters and emails that they've sent to legislators right across this province. Madam Speaker, it behooves us to refer this piece of legislation to a committee so that it can be properly discussed, so that we can have proper consultation, and so that Albertans, all Albertans, not just rural Albertans, but Albertans in all parts of the province can have a proper say, and that we can properly take a look at this legislation and properly study it and hopefully improve it so that it can actually do what it is intended to do. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions or comments under 29.2a?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just wondered if my honourable colleague from the third party, is a veteran of this House, and I'm just curious to know what his thoughts are on, and he touched on them briefly, but I thought perhaps maybe he would be happy to comment on a comment that the Premier had made just last year, and some of the change of opinion from one side of the House to the other when she said, because this has such an incredible far-reaching set of consequences to the lives of so many Albertans, I would suggest that this not be a bill that we ram through at, 4 o'clock in the morning, as this government is scrambling to get out of the legislature so they can run off and slap a whole bunch of ineffective bandages on their broken political vehicle. Now, I understand that it's not quite 4 a.m. yet, but just last year, she recognized the far-reaching set of consequences that affect the lives of so many Albertans as we head towards the close of a session. I wondered if you're just surprised as much as I am that she said one thing in opposition and now another in government.
Well, Madam Speaker, I think it is very safe to say, and certainly I think members of government who once sat here, and certainly for members of the Progressive Conservative caucus that are now sitting in opposition that once were in government, will tell you that perspective is everything. And that perspective on either side of the House certainly changes. And I would suggest to you that and I had this conversation with the Honourable Government House Leader, that we have been learning over these last 7 months how to sit in opposition, indeed an experience that none of us knew very much about prior to May. In the same way, the government is learning how to govern. And I would suggest that any suggestion that they can do it right and that everything can be done perfectly right from the get-go is, I think, asking a lot of anyone. Certainly, the Honourable Premier, when she sat in opposition, was very effective in calling for a number of things for government to do in order to improve legislation as it made its way through the House. And she was also very effective in reminding us when we were in government that there were certain procedures and there was a process that you had to go through in order to engender the trust and engender the support of those, especially those that were directly affected. I would think that those words would be words that she would do well to remember now that she is in the position whereby she and her government can move forward on these pieces of legislation that are indeed so profound and so far-reaching in their potential effects on our agricultural community, on farmers and ranchers across our province, that she and her government should think twice of doing the self-same ramming through of legislation that she was so critical of not more than a year and a half ago. And that is the kind of, I think, learning process that certainly we are doing here in our new role as a member of the opposition, as legislators that are interested in developing legislation that is, in fact, good quality legislation. And I would suggest that the government is also interested in passing good quality legislation. And one of the mechanisms for passing good quality legislation is indeed having the opportunity for parties to come together to discuss this in a less pressure-packed and in a, shall we say, lower temperature environment whereby good, solid, thoughtful decisions can be made with regards to the legislation that we are discussing.